Welcome, everyone. It's really my pleasure to introduce Miel Vander Sande. I'd like to thank him for accepting our invitation in our seminar series. So Miel is a researcher at ID Lab, that was the former multimedia lab of Ghent University. And at the moment is a data architect at MIMO, the Flemish Institute for Archiving. So his work is extremely relevant for also what we do in our lab. So I also, that's why I hope that after this seminar, we will have also the chance to talk about possible collaboration. And he is applying SOLID in the digital heritage domain. So I don't think I have to explain why this is relevant for us. We want to know more about what he and his team is doing. He has a strong background in information science and semantic web, linked open data. So we are really eager to know about your project, Miel, and understand how you intend to use or are using SOLID, because we are also looking into this possibility. So thank you very much, and please, the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you. Everybody can hear me, and my slides are moving.
Yes.
Yes, because
Yes,
I always ask, because sometimes I'm presenting for 5 slides long and nobody sees a difference. Thank you, Valentina. So my name is Miel Vander Sande. I used to work at the team with Ruben Verborg. And before I left, I was working on SOLID. Now I'm a data architect at Flemish Institute for Archives, which is called MIMO, which is in Belgium. And I devote parts of my time working on a project with the Dutch Digital Heritage Network, which is something I will introduce later, which is of course in the Netherlands. So I am, let's say, detached from my position to work on this research project with the mostly people from the National Library there. And this is what I'm going to talk to you about today. So let me start off with looking at the sector as a whole. So if you look at the digital information that is going around in heritage institutions, so in a sense, institutions are quite good in organizing themselves in a decentralized fashion. So they pretty much succeed in managing their collections pretty well, doing this in a digital fashion as well. But of course, with varying degrees of know-how and automation. So not every institution has the same expertise or the same budget to do these kind of things. But in a general sense, they are able to tick all the boxes that you need to be able to manage your collection data, manage the media that is coming with that, and then disseminating this to the audiences that they have. Typically, they do this using a collection management systems for the metadata, a digital assets management system for the media, and then use in most cases, and I'm speaking for the Netherlands and Belgian context. I'm not sure how it is in the rest of Europe, but typically the data that is managed in these top systems come together in a content management system, which then becomes the website, let's say, to make audiences use things. So they are part of a network. They share lots of metadata with institutions like my own, so archives, but also search indexes and so on, and different applications such as search portals or thematic portals. So when do things start to change? Well, usually when they get an assignment where they need to scale up their operations. So they want to have a shared exposure. They have to do a collaboration, a project where collections need to be merged and exposed together because they need to approach for example, new audiences, or there is an event of some sorts. And that's when usually intermediate layers are introduced. This is a process that we observe as not a technological one. So it's not the technology, but rather something where politics in the broad sense. So this means like things that are driven by budgets, by the time, by the region, anything related to that, that creates these intermediate layers. Typically, they are quite short-lived. So budget ends, know-how disappears, especially in the very, very small institutions. There's usually just one person who has some IT background that can manage these kind of systems or develop something from scratch. If they leave, then usually the project also ends, or it can be that the politicians or whoever's in charge just changes their strategy and they allocate efforts somewhere else, and things stop. So the thing is, from a technological perspective, this is, I think, something that we have no control over. And so this is something that will always be the case in cultural heritage. It's something that is just has always been like this. And I think it's more, the question is not how to solve this problem per se with technology, but more how to support this constant change and reorientation of the collection metadata of the different institutions. And that's where we see that the choice of technology could make a difference there, and its main role there is introducing flexibility. So institutions can reorientate their collection metadata to new intermediate layers, to new applications faster, because typically if they have a shared layer, they integrate this in a peer point-to-point fashion. So every time there's a different system, there's a different integration, there are a lot of costs that come with that, because it has to be more or less rebuilt from scratch every time, because it's always a different constellation of institutions. There are different data models, there are different kinds of metadata that need to be integrated. And so we were looking at Solid to see whether it can make a difference in this aspect. And so whether it can create a loosely coupled interoperable network where you can integrate systems and the data that they expose in a more flexible manner. So things can break down and reconstruct it at any time, and the cost would be a lot lower. So I'm going to more or less talk about, so first I'm going to introduce the Dutch Digital Heritage Network, what it is, what the vision is there. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about Solid, but I understand that Ruben was here before, so I won't dive into the detail, we'll keep it short. And then to close, I will talk about the building blocks that this project is trying to come up with to build a decentralized digital heritage network. So the Dutch Digital Heritage Program, which is called NDE, is really a national strategy in the Netherlands, which has more or less gathered all the different institutions, stakeholders, software vendors in one program backed up by the government. And in a sense, what they're trying to do is all these different networks, all these different constellations, all these collaborations that are more grassroots, that are really constructed bottom up and very sparse. And they're trying to consolidate this more on a national level, to see cooperations between a lot of organizations, different roles, libraries, archives, museums, and all the other cultural heritage institutions that might be around. Connect this to the local networks on different levels of government. But also, like I said, the software vendors. So it's really important that the people who are working on the technology are there as well. And of course, all these have different sizes, small, medium, large, big, and they also have different funding schemes and so on. So trying to really get everybody behind the same strategy. And where are they focusing on? Mostly on everything, so everything digital, let's say, all the activities that they are doing about improving the visibility of the collections, everything that they publish, making sure that it is better for reuse, and also making the network between these, the whole landscape, let's say, tighter and better connected. The program exists more or less out of 3 parts, let's say. So visible, usable, and sustainable. The visible part is about helping institutions do marketing campaigns, communication, helping there with clearing their licenses and so on. The sustainable part is then to make sure that institutions that adopt these strategies are also able to sustain them. So identifiers, persistent identifiers, but also business models and so on. And then the part where this project is really operating is the usable program. And this is about creating infrastructure that is able to get the data from the institutions, bring it into a network where it can be reused, where it can be more tightly connected, and where it can sustain for a longer, or like I said, this flexibility where the applications can get to the data. A little bit about this program, the usable program. So its main focus is really about users. And typically the users that look for cultural heritage information start in Google. And they have this issue that like the long tail of the Dutch cultural heritage metadata usually does not show up in the search results. So it's really this long tail of data that is being out there to expose this and give this way more visibility by providing an infrastructure that can do that. And so the problem is not that there are no portals. So there are a lot of different applications, websites that make this content accessible. But users also have trouble knowing which portal to use, which information does it contain, which institutions are providing the data that fuels these websites. And so they wonder whether they can browse from one portal to another. And so underneath they have, what really happens is that there is, over a long period of time, it's a few organizations started with one aggregator, so one intermediate layer, and then just more and more aggregators started to exist that would just combine data everywhere and then expose it at portals. But now they're in the situation where they want to diminish these kind of aggregators because it's hard to reuse them. There's a lot of sync issues and more or less the lack of flexibility that I was talking about earlier. So they want to rebuild the network by focusing on the sources. So they have the collection registration systems. And then they have the portals, and they want to connect this by creating a network layer that exists out of a couple of components. So they want to create a data platform where data sources can expose the metadata to live in a let's say combined network of data where the thematic portals can go and access this data. In addition, they want to offer services like the network of terms, which is a way to expose the different thesauri. So institutions that run a collection registration system can use the things and not strings to really use different terms or the same terms. And then in the end, the idea is that they would increase the visibility on the web. And in order to do that, they offer the second role, and that is a register, where different descriptions of data sets that an institution has, they can advertise it, and that's how it would spread around the network. So data portals would know where to look for which kind of data. So that's the idea. So who's gonna drink? It's kind of warm. So the idea is there to switch this network of aggregators by, let's say, a more caching-oriented strategy where everything that is intermediate is more pointing applications to the right sources rather than collecting the data itself and trying to aggregate everything. So what is this project doing in this story? So this project is called the FHootBot project, which is a collaboration between the Heritage Network, my organization MIMO, and Ghent University till 2023. And the main research question there is looking at a decentralized social network and looking whether the principles of a social network is a good basis for implementing such a sustainable network of digital heritage. So we're looking at Solid particularly because it originates in this decentralized social network, but kind of a few things are different, meaning that it's not about people, but it's about institutions, service providers, and applications that are sharing data. It's not personal data, but collection data. And the project is really aiming at providing the missing building blocks that Solid is not providing to really implement something like this. And in the end, it should support the Dutch and the Flemish context in cultural heritage, but hopefully also more than that. So a little bit about Solid now. So Solid started as an alternative vision at MIT for social media, but by now it's a little bit more than that. It's about really splitting services from the data that they use, and so really centralizing the web. And so they also focus on outputting principles, best practices, standards, components. And in the end, the idea is that users manage and control their own data in a data pod where they can give applications selective access. So everything that they know, that all the data about themselves is in one place. So if you look at the centralized perspective where both the data and the service was in one web application, so you had to copy your data everywhere to every application. This is now all contained, all data in one data pod, and different applications access the information that they need. And in the end, the idea is here that because both data and services in one place, it's also hard to move data around and create competition. While if you separate those, you also separate the markets, and data becomes a lot more mobile, and different players can create the same application and create competition between different app and in the data markets. So concrete output of Solid is mostly done in the Solid community group. So they mostly output open protocols that you can use to create these kind of decentralized web networks. It's all based on web standards, HTTP, linked data platform mostly, but also linked data notifications. I would advise you to look at the solidproject.org website if you want to know more about the progress that they are making. But to summarize, they define, let's say, how a data pod should look like, how you can interact with it. And this also includes everything that has to do with authentication, authorization, and interoperability. Okay, that was it for Solid. Now the project itself. So the idea here is that if you're an institution and you have your collection management system and your digital asset management system, that you basically use it as your main metadata exchange hub in the network. So the cultural heritage pod is this concept where an institution stores their metadata in a Solid data pod, which consists, of course, as the same architecture as a normal Solid pod would look like. So it has a linked data platform API. It has an inbox where it can receive notifications. It has an ACL layer to manage authorization. But something that we add is an immutable log. So there's one thing that we add to the mix, and that is there is one resource that you have to expose, and it's an immutable log of events that happened to a certain artifact. So an artifact is a data set, for example, something that an institution exposes and wants to share with others. So from that data pod, the idea is that institution can grant external services, so registers, archives, other indexes, access to the collection metadata that they store in that. So the metadata about the artifacts. And that's how they build up the network. A service, on the other hand, are provided in something that we call a service hub. And basically a service hub is an encapsulation of a certain cultural heritage service, which we consider as black boxes. So this is on purpose to say, like, okay, an archive can choose how they do their job, or an index can have their own implementation. We are more interested about the interface that they expose in order to be interoperable and in order to communicate with the institutions, their data pods. So they also expose an inbox, and they also have the same kind of log where an immutable log where all the events are recorded that the service, for example, does in relation to the artifacts. How do they communicate? Well, they use notifications. So if an institution wants to let a service hub know, like, hey, I have this new data set, then it just exposes a notification that very similar to a social network, where you say, well, you know, I have this new data set, and everybody who's interested can get this data set, process it, do some kind of service on it, and then let the institution know what they did to the artifact. This is very non-committal, and that's very on purpose to make sure that the network is very loose coupled and scalable. Does this mean that you have no guarantees? Well, no, you can. The idea here is that on an interoperable protocol level, we keep everything open and voluntary, but there are, I think, things like you can do in collaboration agreements. This is like taken care of on a higher level. What we use is, or we're looking at linked data notifications and activity streams, basically working on more concrete profiles. So really looking at, okay, what are the messages that different actors in the network can send to each other? And we're testing ActivityPub for this. So we're really looking at a decentralized social networking protocol to see how far we can go to mimic a social network using, let's say, actors from the cultural heritage. Now, of course, not everything should be done manually. So you can send, of course, these notifications manually, but that would be a lot of work. So we also define 2 components that you can use. So first of all, the management of the data pod and the data that is exposed to the network, a maintainer can use a dashboard for that. So that is how it talks to its exchange hub, the solid pod, but also to the orchestrator. And the orchestrator is our proposal to introduce automation in the network. So it's an autonomous component that operates based on machine readable business processes. So let's say that I'm an institution and I have a couple of data sets in my data pod. Then there are also rules that I have to apply because it's the policy of my institution, or because it's, for example, the policy of the Dutch Heritage Network. And you can automate this by writing machine readable business process on that then the orchestrator will do on your behalf. And so the orchestrator is able to send notifications when you are not around and respond as long as you tell it what it should do in those cases. So in a sense, that's how you can consolidate a lot of different views on how, let's say, life cycle events of artifacts should be handled. On the other side, once the information is distributed over the network, you also have to have a way to collect it again. And there we're looking into a component that we call the collector, and it applies a, let's say, targeted crawling approach to find life cycle events over the network. So it's really about finding out what happened to a certain data set, what happened to a certain cultural heritage object, and everything that might be relevant, or looking for example, which source has artworks using oil paint, for instance. Now you can say, okay, people can tamper with these event logs. They can do different things. How do you protect the integrity? Well, there we are really looking at using the scalability of the network to create a more practical best effort solutions for things like this. And basically, we're looking at creating redundancy in different events. So if an archive says, I have archived it, and a lot of other different institutions say, yeah, in fact, this artifact was archived by this institution, then the collector will retrieve this information, and you can conclude that you can pretty much trust that that there is an archive that contains this artifact. And this also, we're also looking at, for example, linked data signatures to make sure that events and notifications that are being sent around, that they come from the source that you expected. So in the end, we want to end up with an implementation layer that looks more or less like this. So we had the design from NDE before, and we looking at all these different roles that were identified and providing them with more or less the same architecture. So they have all the same components that I mentioned before. So a query index where the collector can find information, an orchestrator to automate the business processes that they need to do, and then an inbox and an event log to be able to receive notifications and also advertise what they have done with a certain artifact. And basically, it's a layered system in a sense that the registers, the data platform, the network of terms, they're all, let's say, sort of caches that use the solid network to get summaries or get information about the sources, let's say metadata about sources, not the objects themselves, to be able to provide then another service to the portals that can navigate them to the sources that have relevant information. So the project structure is as follows. So this is actually a collaboration with another big project and a PhD scholarship. So we have a big generic part where we are working on different protocols and components that are just general decentralized exchange networks where you can exchange artifacts of every sort. We have 3 use cases, mainly the digital heritage use case, which is this project, and then another one on scientific communication, where people are exchanging papers and talking about the life cycle of these papers. And then building construction about architects and contractors who have to exchange plans and timing and planning. The deliverables that we have are similar to, they kind of built on top of what Solid is providing, but providing more specificity. So the different components that I mentioned all get, we're trying to get the implementation requirements and the specifications of these protocols and components into different documents. And then from the FWIT project, which is this project, there are some additional things which are really about the use case of, or let's say the cultural heritage context, like the different use cases, the business processes that are typical, and an architecture. So it gets really, really concrete if different institutions want to work in this kind of network. Okay, so that concludes my talk. I thank you for listening.
Thank you, Miel. Thank you very much. And okay, so actually now we have some time for questions. So if there is any comments or question, please raise your hand. Let me check. Otherwise, I would start while giving you some time to make up your mind. Okay, so
sorry, Valentina, I cannot find the
okay,
the button.
Okay, go ahead, Christian.
Can I go? Would you go? Would you like
No,
to
go ahead.
forward?
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. This was very interesting, and I have a question about the service that you show to access a solid pod. I would like to know if are you responsible for project and realize those components, or are they provided by the solid platform? So the API to access solid pods.
So I think that the main difference between what Solid does and what this project does is, so Solid focuses on the data pod. So what is a data pod? What does it have? How do you interface with it? How do you get access to resources in the data pod? And then in this project, we focus more on, okay, what if you have a bunch of data pods and you want to organize them in an ecosystem or a network, and they have to communicate and actually get work done. So you have to, if you're an institution and you have all your collection metadata in a pod, that's where the role of Solid stops. But usually institutions are part of a big network where you have indexes, you have archives, and they have to communicate with those and say, hey, archive, I have a new data set. Can you archive it, please? And usually this is not one archive, but maybe 2 or 3, depending on what level you're operating, for instance. So I would say that Solid is about the pod aspect, and this project is about the network aspect.
Okay, thank you very much. Very clear.
Any other questions from the audience? Actually, Miel, I wanted to ask you, so first of all, I didn't realize this was a project basically that is now starting. Now I learned this, and so it's really interesting that what you say clearly. So one thing I was wondering for a while is how it's the same for us. So we work with the different institutions in one of our projects, actually more than one, but I'm particularly thinking at one of them, which is Polyphonia. And we want to, so more than integrating institutions, we are thinking at, so putting institutions in a network, we are thinking on how to keep a decentralized approach in integrating the data. That's why we thought that some feel related to Solid. And my understanding is that you actually identified that Solid is a good starting point, but there is a lot of missing aspects that, so I have 2 questions. One is very detailed, because I wanted to ask you if you could comment a little bit more on this immutable log that you mentioned, just to understand what it is it meant for? So why did you think?
So first thing, what you have to understand that this project originally came from the scientific communication use case. So in a sense, so this is a project that I wrote while I was still at STLab. Now I have the assignment basically to apply the things that we are doing in that project to the cultural heritage use case. So from that perspective, the log in scientific communication is really about, what if we don't have scientific publishers that centralize all our papers, but we have, let's say, more peer-to-peer communication between researchers, between scientific institutions. In that sense, you have 4 functions, which is basically about, a service that certifies, that registers your paper, that certifies your paper, that makes people aware about your paper, and that archives it. So that are 4 things that need to be done in order to, make sure that scientific communication works. But since they are decentralized, you somehow need to know who did what to your paper. Let's say I create a paper, I say I have a new paper. You say, okay, I review it, then this review is yours. It's in your data pod. But somehow I need to know, or at least the network needs to know, that you created a review, which is another type of artifact, on my paper. And so that's why the logs are necessary for people who want to know or ask the network questions like, was this paper reviewed? What happened to this paper? Was it archived in the end, or did it get accepted somewhere? Was it peer reviewed? And because you cannot, so we don't have this luxury of having centralized institutions that we trust. So we need to have some way to to be able to know what party did what to which artifact. And so in the cultural heritage domain, this is less about, did people cheat with the scientific communication, but it's more about, knowing who did what to a certain data set. So an institution will create a new data set, publish a new data set, but an archive will archive it. So it's the archive who has to say, I archived this, I archived that. This is not information that an institution has because it's not part of its way of working. And that's why it's important to have some way to retrieve from every node in the network what they did to a certain artifact in order to get the full picture. Because else it's this idea where you scale this decentralized network to a scale that you don't really have a view on who had what, because one institution can choose archive A, another institution can choose archive B, and you don't really know where things are if you cannot check, let's say, at least a log. So that's one big requirement. Yeah.
Okay, and actually, my second question now, it came another one while you were talking. But so one is more general, like I wanted to ask you, in your experience, considering what the solid community has achieved so far in terms of implementation, what do you think are the concrete implementations that are there that can be reusable, easily reusable in a project like yours or any other project? So what would you say, okay, these are things that you can actually build from, right? And these other things, they are like ongoing, so it's better you look into something you do for you and contribute.
So I think Solid will have, or at least they plan more output or more concrete output by the end of the year. So this is, I think, maybe frustrating for projects like ours that, Solid itself is pretty much in flux as well. I think the basic principle of the data pod are all W3C specs that were there already. So you can already start implementing this. There is a community server that actually does this as well. And there are already some applications that allow you to look into the data pod and see, what kind of resources you have in there. I know that they are still working on just getting the specifications of authentication and authorization ready. For us, this is not a huge problem because we're working with open data anyway. But one of the frustrating things that I have, well, frustrating, things that we have to take let's say a leap, or is the notification aspect. So they did not start really working on how you can, notify a data pod that's about something. So you have the linked data notification specification. It's already out there. It's standardized, but it's really, really generic. And that's why we're looking at let's say concrete profiles of these specs and saying like, okay, this is the list of messages that you have to use or can use. This is how they have to look like. And then of course, looking for this balance between having something generic and also having something that can actually achieve interoperability. I wasn't sure whether you were asking for software or specifications, because
well, both, although software is particularly interesting to, for example, in our case, we have a project where we don't have, like, it's not a software project, right? So we, in our project, we don't So we didn't plan to make an implementation of Solid, for example, so we don't have resources for this, but we are looking at how to implement a distributed architecture, and we would like to use or make an implementation that is compatible with the Solid principles and specifications. Clearly, if there are software components that you can reuse, this would make our life easier, because otherwise, if you have to think, okay, you have to, to make a whole implementation of it with also maybe some specifications that are not yet stable, then probably we're just too early, and we cannot go for it, and it would be really a pity. So
well, I would say look at the community server. Look at the community server, and another project I think is interesting. It's related to this one, but it's from the same. So it's also a Dutch Digital Heritage Network project. It's about creating a collection management system that uses Solid, and it's specifically steered at the very, very small organizations. So it's called Solid for Little Organizations, literally, and they contracted a company to make a proof of concept of a very minimal collection registration system that an institution can use. And the idea there is that without them knowing it, they are already Solid compliant. So when they're just managing their collections, they can already be part of a Solid network. And that is, of course, very interested to this project as well, because that is an aspect that we do not tackle.
Okay. And yeah, one last question. I see there are no hands raised, so I take the opportunity to continue, but of course, the others are very welcome to intervene. So one thing, you talked a lot about metadata, right? So because clearly most of these organizations, they also historically mainly deal with metadata. But knowledge graphs also can contain data. What I mean is that they can contain, so they can represent the, talking about cultural heritage, for example, you can have data about cultural properties and information about them. So a sort of like a projection of the real world, in a sense, in a knowledge graph. And so this came to my mind when you said, when you were talking about the immutable log, no? Like about, so in that case, I understand your focus is mainly, so the artifact you're talking about are mainly the data set, like, okay, this data set, this was the, I don't know, the history, like versions or whatever was there, and who did what, and things like that. But I was wondering, so this is, I don't know, it was just like a thought that came to my mind when we were talking about this. Because, for example, if you think about cultural properties and their history, no, in terms of, so also for thinking about preservation or protection of this kind of the object itself, more than the documents that, so I was thinking if you, I don't know, if this makes sense to you, like that this in a network of institutions that handle cultural heritage, this mechanism can also be useful to in sharing or processes, information for supporting processes that have to do with protection and preservation. So instead of having, talking about the data set, having an immutable log instead about the object that are referred.
So, so the reason that I talk about this concept artifact is in fact because it's up to the ecosystem that wants to use, the protocols that and concepts that we are generating in this project, I mean, the idea is that there is not one decentralized network. It's more about, you have these institutions, they want to collaborate, they can use these concepts to come up with a collaboration and exchange network. And it's up to them to decide what the artifact is. So if you want to make every object an artifact, then you will have very fine-grained data, which is, I think, fine if you keep the scale of the network relatively small. And the reason that we focus on data sets is because we are really, let's say, very into the practical side of things. I mean, we are literally working in cultural heritage. We are cultural heritage organizations ourselves, and we just know from practice that looking at exchange on a data set level is for us at this point the most realistic, because if you go deeper, it just becomes more complex, but it's also definitely something you can do.
Certainly the data sets, the first level is the possibility to integrate data sets, right?
Yeah.
I was thinking at a very specific use case, where there are institutions that communicate with between each other for specific aspects, and this can be, for example, the protection, right? They need to know, and this can be a potentially interesting approach for them to share data, because there are, there is maybe an institution which is in charge of, I don't know, defining the policies for interventions or for protection, but it doesn't work alone. What I mean is that it needs data from many others in order to take decisions. So this can be, now clearly this happens by a mix of different procedures and exchanges of data in various forms.
But I think what you say reminds me a lot of the building construction use case that we have there. It's really about, let's say, snippets of data, more, exchanging building regulations, exchanging measurements of things. So they go a lot more fine-grained in the information that they exchange. Also and which is, for example, completely different to the scientific communication use case. There, it's really about, papers are still PDFs, all right? So they don't even assume that there is any, machine readable paper in there. Is just, exchanging the PDFs on a more decentralized manner is already a win. And then we are a bit in between, because we exchange data sets, but the services that then exchange these data sets look into them, of course, because, like I said, their main purposes of this network is to be able to navigate portals to sources with relevant information. And that's why they also need to know what's in the data sets as well. So I think it definitely works on different levels, and we are dealing with this kind of thing as well. I can't say much about it yet because we didn't go there.
Thanks. But anyway, so as this reminded you to about another use case, it means it makes some sense. So this is already something. Okay, thank you very much for answering all my questions. Is there any other comment or questions from our colleagues? Okay.
In any case, you can always mail me or find me on Twitter or whatever.
Thanks.
Always happy to discuss.
Thank you, Miel. Actually, yeah, I think I will certainly like to get in touch and see how we can link our projects and try to to be updated on both sides, because I think that there is a point where we can connect, especially as we are going to also to build our infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we may want to discuss possibly, for example, about some of these components that you described. So if we need to do something similar, maybe we can discuss on and agree on a common, so this can be a collaborative project. Of course, we do all the implementations that we do are open, but it would be great to share, and maybe you can both benefit and contribute, and so we can maybe build a software architecture that can be reused in in both projects. Actually, we are already working in collaboration. So we have 2 projects. So what I mean is that maybe we can build a small community that is, you know, we can build a small software project that I mean, a software project which in the end results as an implementation of Solid 4 cultural heritage. And why not? We can share a bit of the effort in what we need to do. So I think I will certainly contact you if you want to discuss this more in detail with the team that is working on this. I guess it would be a win-win situation. And besides that, I thank you again very much, really, for the nice and interesting talk. Yeah, thank you again, and I hope to get in touch with you very soon.
Yep, thank you all.